All right, in this explainer, we are diving deep into a concept that gets talked about a lot, jihad. But we're going to look at it through a very specific lens, the text, The Noble Life of the Prophet. We're going to unpack what that book lays out as the real goals of this striving or struggling. So right off the bat, before we get into any of the details, the source material just hits us with this foundational question that really frames everything else. What does it actually mean to strive? And we're not just looking for a simple definition here. This is about getting to the very heart of the philosophy itself.
First things first, the book makes it clear that the essence of this struggle is, at its core, spiritual. It argues that before you can even think about any external action, the whole journey has to start on the inside.
And this quote right here, this sets the stage for the primary goal. According to the text, the whole point of striving, the ultimate purpose, is to seek and hopefully receive divine guidance. It's framed as this deeply personal commitment to a cause that's bigger than yourself, which in turn is said to unlock a path to deeper understanding.
Okay, so once that internal spiritual foundation is set, the text then pivots to the first set of external goals. And these are described mostly as defensive, actions focused on protecting some really fundamental freedoms.
So the source material uses this verse to talk about removing something it calls fitna. Now that's a term for things like persecution and oppression, anything that stops people from being able to choose what they believe. So the goal described here isn't about forcing belief on anyone, but about creating a world where people can choose their faith freely without being coerced.
And here's where the text makes a really crucial point. This idea of protecting religious freedom, it's not presented as being exclusive to just one faith. Actually, the argument gets a whole lot bigger from here. This verse is brought up as direct evidence for a much broader mission. The argument being made is that without some kind of defensive force to keep aggressors in check, all houses of worship, not just one kind, would be at risk of being destroyed.
And look how explicit this is. The text isn't just speaking in general terms. It literally lists the sanctuaries of several different faiths: Christian monasteries and churches, Jewish synagogues, and of course, Muslim mosques. The principle here is pretty clear: a universal protection for all places where people worship.
So, moving from that defensive mindset, the book then outlines a more proactive goal: the need to actively stand up to corruption and injustice wherever you find it in society. This is presented as just a fundamental rule of how society works. The idea is that power has to be checked by other power to keep everything in balance. The text argues that without that check, corruption and chaos, what's called mischief here, would just run wild and take over. And it's not just about keeping society in balance. The source really hammers home a direct human responsibility, a duty to protect the people who can't protect themselves. I mean, this is such a powerful and direct call to action. The verse is basically a moral gut check, asking believers, why wouldn't you stand up for the weak and oppressed who are crying out for help? It really frames this struggle as a response to a humanitarian crisis. But the text is very clear that this external struggle isn't the whole story. All of this difficulty, all this hardship, it's also meant to serve a really profound internal purpose. So here, the struggle is presented as a kind of divine test. It's described as a way to see who has true conviction and to identify the people who show real patience, what the text calls as-sabirin, or the patient ones, especially when things get incredibly tough. The real goal is to purify the believer's own character. So you see this clear duality, right? On one side, you've got the external action, confronting injustice in the world. And on the other, you've got the internal reason for it all, to forge your soul, to purify your faith and commitment through that very same hardship. And all of this brings us to what the source presents as the ultimate goal for society, the thing that all these other goals are building towards: establishing true justice. You know what's really striking here is the condition put on this justice. The text argues it has to be your guiding principle, even when you're dealing with people you dislike, maybe even people you'd consider enemies. That command to be just is tied directly to piety, which really elevates it to one of the highest spiritual virtues you can have. This really connects all the dots. According to this book, any power or strength you might gain isn't for its own sake. It's not about domination or conquest. It's simply a tool, a means to an end, and that end is to uphold and enforce justice for everyone. And the book lands with this very pragmatic thought. It connects all those philosophical goals back to a very practical reality. that the ability to defend a just society is absolutely essential for it to even survive. Without strength, all those ideals of justice and freedom are just vulnerable. And so this whole explainer ends right where it began, with a question. After looking at all the goals laid out in the noble life of the prophet, the text ultimately leaves us all with a challenge, to really think about that fine line between strength that's used for justice and strength that becomes something else entirely.